Hi friends, Tracy here to tell you that making a podcast is hard work. There's research, scripts, editing, and all of that can mean a million decisions. Fortunately for me, my choice in a podcast hosting platform was easy because I decided upon Anchor by Spotify. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your podcast today. Welcome to CrescentCityCrime, dear listeners. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Brian.
And thank you to everybody who has kept their ears on us. And if you are new here, then welcome.
Yes, thank you for listening. We really appreciate your listenership, and we enjoy doing this for you.
Yes, we very much do. And of course, thank you to Lucy, who has been running our social medias.
Thank you, Lucy.
And before we, I almost stumbled right there. Before we dive into the episode proper, I wanted to share an update. I have an update. So we're actively following the Ronald Green case. And for those who don't know what this is about, Ronald Green was a black man who was pulled over by Louisiana State Troopers in 2019. They beat him to death, but they tried to lie and say that he died as a result of a car accident. There is a saying that I actually learned from Brian, that the cover-up is worse than the initial crime committed. And make no mistake, there was a cover-up surrounding this death. We will be discussing this case on future episodes, but it was announced today that the prosecutor for the district that the death occurred in, John Belton, plans to impanel a special grand jury to weigh charges for those involved in Green's death. It's unclear who Belton wants to scrutinize, and he can't discuss specific charges, but he has said that he believes that the troopers broke the law during Ronald Green's arrest, and he will be convening a special grand jury soon. This case is being investigated by the FBI, and John Belton recently met with U.S. Attorney Merrick Garland, who indicated that they are wrapping up the investigation. And John Belton has also announced that he is making a bid for Louisiana Attorney General. He will be running against the current Attorney General, Jeff Landry. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, we have established that Jeff Landry is not a friend of the podcast. So good luck to you, John Belton.
Yes, good luck unseating this particularly political Attorney General who seems to have a pretty...
a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, a chip on his shoulder, and an agenda that really involves fighting for the people of Louisiana on occasion.
It mainly seems like he's interested in fighting with his colleagues who don't agree with him.
As well as a future bid for governor.
Oh, yeah.
More likely.
Yeah.
As he's the typical attorney general who just loves to use his political office to campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like getting free campaign funds, kind of.
You're right.
Whereas you file lawsuits, and I guess you could say this is, put this in quotations, filing lawsuits on behalf of the citizens of Louisiana, okay, so that he could turn around like a typical politician and say, "Oh, look what I've done for you."
Right.
Vote for me. Contribute to my campaign. I'm fighting for you. When what he's really doing is campaigning for himself. Kind of like there were certain attorney generals, which Jeff Landry didn't do this, okay, but there are other attorney generals who have even filed lawsuits against gun companies with the same kind of agenda.
Right. Okay, well,
Now, not only is the cover up worse than the crime, but in law enforcement, the cover up itself is incriminating.
it very much is.
If you want to be charged with a crime, malfeasance in office at the very least, go ahead and cover something up. Like a police officer who wasn't, let's say, if it's possible for a police officer to get criminally charged involving a cover-up, even if the officer is not guilty of or even suspected of doing of committing the initial crime that initiated the cover-up.
Right.
To get incriminated in the entire thing, to get your hands dirty the entire thing, all you have to do is participate in the cover-up.
That's correct. And if any of you who, I assume that you're listening to this podcast because you are a true crime aficionado. And if you are a true crime aficionado, then you've probably seen documentaries or read news stories in your very own local paper about cover-ups involving law enforcement. It has happened many times before all across the country.
In most situations, you're better off owning your mistake than engaging in a cover-up.
Yes, and let that be a lesson to any of the younglings listening to this podcast. Own your mistake and get it over with. Because if you lie, and this doesn't even necessarily have to be law enforcement, it could be related to a job, it could be related to your marriage, anything. Don't lie about it. Just come clean right away. And I'm going to tell you that the anticipation of coming clean is worse than coming clean. So don't think about it. Just come clean.
Yes, don't get involved in a cover up. It gets really sticky. You tell the first lie, and then you wind up telling
100 more.
Yeah, more and more lies and then before you know it, you're being investigated by the FBI.
Yes, and you don't want to get investigated by the FBI because they will tear your life apart. All right. Well, Brian, in our current world of 2022, pride is a thing. It's been corporatized. There's pride celebrations, well, in most places throughout the world now, right? But back in 1973, there was not much pride. There wasn't any pride celebrations in New Orleans. Did you know that?
I did not know that. I'm not aware of when it started in New Orleans.
Well, it was sort of here all along because there was a gay community here before pride became a national corporatized thing.
Right.
Okay?
You're talking about celebration of pride and having a parade.
Yes, that kind of thing. Right. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So this was on a Sunday evening, June 24th of 1973. And pride celebrations were taking place in seemingly every major American city but New Orleans. However, there was a regular beer bust drink special at the UpStairs Lounge, which was located on Iberville and Charter Streets in the French Quarter. The building is 3 stories there, and the UpStairs Lounge, was on the 2nd floor. The building is still there. The crowd who came to this bar was local, blue-collar, and members of the LGBTQ community. Members of the Metropolitan Community Church, a pro-LGBTQ Protestant denomination, were there after a service. The MCC was the United States' first national gay Christian fellowship, founded in Los Angeles in 1968, and the local congregation held services in the UpStairs Lounge. That night, the beer bust went from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. and attracted approximately 110 patrons. After the drink special ended, about 60 to 90 patrons remained. So think about that, 60 to 90 lives inside of this building. They listened to pianist George Stephen Bud Matai performed, and they discussed an upcoming MCC fundraiser for the local children's hospital. At 7:56 p.m., a buzzer from downstairs sounded, and the bartender, Buddy Rasmussen, who was an Air Force veteran, asked a patron named Luther Boggs to answer the door. They were anticipating a taxicab driver, but when Boggs opened the door, he saw that the front staircase was engulfed in flames and he could smell lighter fluid. Rasmussen immediately led about 20 patrons out of the back exit to the roof, where that group could access a neighboring building's roof and climb down to the ground floor. Some patrons saw the floor-to-ceiling windows in the bar as the most promising means of escape, despite the fact that there were safety bars on the windows. These bars had a 14-inch gap between them to prevent people from breaking through the glass and falling to the ground. However, several people managed to squeeze through, and some were on fire when they reached the ground below.
Sad.
Luther Boggs pushed a female friend through the gap in the window, and this resulted in Boggs receiving third-degree burns to half of his body, and he would die from his injuries 10 days after the fire.
And that was obviously very painful, as burn injuries. The pain is ever present.
Yeah, I've had first-degree burns, and I know that it's painful, but I know it's not nearly as painful as a third-degree burn.
Although some third-degree burns are so severe that you don't feel the pain in the site because the nerves.
They destroy the nerve endings?
Yeah.
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 Reverend Bill Larson of the MCC removed an air conditioning unit from the bottom of one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he was attempting to get out when the upper pane of glass fell on top of him and pinned him to the window frame. His body was half in the building and half out, and he died from his injuries, and his charred remains would be visible to onlookers for hours afterwards. This image of his body has been recorded in pictures taken of the front of the building in the aftermath. And you can go look up those photos yourself, but be warned that they are disturbing. MCC Assistant Pastor George Mitchell managed to escape, but he returned in an attempt to rescue his partner, Louis Horace Broussard. Both of them died in the fire, and their remains were found clinging to each other. Mitchell's children were visiting him from out of town, and eventually a friend took them to the airport and sent them home to their mother without ever telling them what happened to their father. You believe that? That's horrible. The whole thing.
Yeah, it is.
Firefighters were stationed only 2 blocks away, but they found themselves blocked by cars and pedestrian traffic. One fire truck tried to maneuver on the sidewalk, but it crashed into a taxi. When the firefighters managed to bring the fire under control, they found patrons still alive and struggling to fit through the bars. 28 people died that night as a result of the fire, and 18 suffered injuries. And the fire was able to burn for 16 minutes. Of course, this leads to the question of who did this and why. And I'm sorry to tell you that there was never a clear answer to this question. The only suspect in the attack was Roger Dale Nunez. He had been ejected from the bar earlier in the evening after fighting with another customer. 3 years before this, in 1970, Nunez had been diagnosed with conversion disorder, which was formerly called hysteria. This is a type of mental disorder in which a wide variety of sensory, motor, or psychic disturbances may occur. He had been released from a treatment facility in the year before the fire. When police attempted to question Nunez, he was hospitalized with a broken jaw and either could not or would not respond. But when he was questioned later, police observed that Nunez had not appeared nervous. An unnamed witness claimed that he had seen Nunez in and out of the bar during the 10 to 20 minutes before the fire, and also said that he had seen nobody enter or leave the building. But because police observed that the witness was stressed out, they dismissed the witness as a liar. Now, I want to hear your take on that, Brian.
Seems to me like police that were doing the questioning were not terribly sympathetic because of the kind of bar that it was, very, very judgmental and hateful types, apparently. And that was an era where most cops were homophobic and bigoted against, definitely against the gay community.
Mm-hmm.
Neither one of those assessments has any ring of truth to it whatsoever. Someone who's a witness to that is not going to be very calm, and someone who commits arson is going to try to be as calm as they can,
right,
in front of investigators. If he was, he's definitely on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a sign of guilt. Not proof of guilt alone, but definitely a sign of guilt, and demonstrates that he was worthy of further investigation.
Exactly. Thank you for that response. By the way, everybody, I want y'all to know that Brian pulled a long day today, and he's coming here to record tonight like a trooper. So thank you, Brian, especially.
You're welcome.
We had a long day.
Another glorious day, my beloved Hollywood South.
Yeah. After his arrest, Nunez escaped from psychiatric custody, and he was never picked up again by the police.
Sounds like they weren't terribly interested.
They were not. Nunez was seen frequently in the French Quarter, so people saw him around. It's not like he didn't leave the city. He wasn't really hiding. A friend later told investigators that Nunez confessed on at least 4 occasions to starting the fire. He told a friend he squirted the bottom steps with Ronald lighter fluid, which he bought at a local Walgreens, and tossed a match. He did not realize, he claimed, that the whole place would go up in flames.
That's a lie. That's a lie. Lighter fluid, starter fluid,
gasoline.
Those two items in particular.
Lighter fluid and
starter fluid are both tools of the arsonist. They're also frequently used when someone sets their car on fire, committing insurance fraud.
Is it because the starter fluid and lighter fluid comes in like little bottles that you could just put in your pocket, as opposed to, say, lugging around a can of gasoline?
It's safer,
yeah,
than lugging around a can of gasoline. Doesn't have the smell, and it's easier. But it's safer to light starter fluid or lighter fluid on fire than it is to light gasoline on fire.
Huh.
You have a reasonable, if you light gasoline on fire, you have a chance of the flames
whooshing upwards.
Whooshing upwards towards you.
Is that because of the fumes from the gasoline?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yes, gasoline constantly emits fumes, so you have that danger. But the lighter fluid and starter fluid is just amazingly effective at starting fires. And once you start a fire with that stuff, it moves very, very fast.
Yes.
They don't call it starter fluid for nothing.
Right. Nunez took his own life in November 1974, so a year and a few months after the fire, he killed himself.
Yeah, he obviously had serious psychological issues, and that's probably
part of it.
a huge factor in the suicide. I seriously doubt he was living with any guilt involving his crime.
Mm-hmm. In 1980, the state fire marshal's office, lacking any leads, closed the case. So there was never officially any person, or there was never any official record of anybody who did this, except for Nunez, who was the only person questioned.
So they just conveniently closed the case, thinking, well, he committed suicide anyway. And once again, we have authorities with no sympathy for the gay community, just bowing out of the performance of duties.
And why do I get the feeling that file just sat on a shelf for years and gathered dust?
It's called File 13.
What does that mean?
It means nothing ever comes of it.
Oh, okay. Well,
it's like File 13 could also mean it's the trash can.
Oh, so somebody might have thrown the file away.
That's how that expression started.
Oh, okay.
As far as like a bureaucracy goes, saying that it's in File 13 means you're not going to do anything about it. You're not going to do anything with the file.
Gotcha.
It also is indifference. It means you don't care, which is no surprise given that it's 1973.
That is true. In 2013, Robert L. Camina produced a documentary about the attack. The name of the documentary is called UpStairs, Inferno, and you can watch it for free on Tubi TV, but I will leave a link to the IMDb page in the show notes. The documentary points out that news outlets minimize the fact that the LGBTQ patrons constituted the majority of the victims, and editorials and talk radio hosts made light of the event, and no government officials made any mention of the fire whatsoever.
Institutional hatred at its worst, yeah, pretty much.
It's quite different today. This would have been all over the news. People would have cared more, that kind of thing.
Yes, because fortunately today, more and more people understand that regardless of someone's race or sexual orientation, that when a human being is victimized, it is a human being victimized who loves other people the same exact way as you, feels pain the same exact way as anyone else, and has family members and friends who care about them the same way you care about your friends and family.
Very well put, Brian. Now, sadly, the lack of empathy led to many of the victims being unidentified. So, a lot of people who died that night, nobody actually knows their names. Several families did not step forward to identify anybody or claim remains. A few anonymous individuals paid for 3 of the burials, and those people were all buried in a mass grave at Holt Cemetery with an identified victim named Ferris LeBlanc. But LeBlanc's family did not learn of his death until 2015.
That's a long time.
Well,
that's like an MIA case.
Yeah, missing in action for those who don't know.
Waiting that long.
Well, it kind of seems to me though, if he was not identified until 2015, or I'm sorry, if they didn't learn of his death until 2015, it doesn't feel like anybody really came looking for him either.
Which is
tragic.
These people did nothing more than what anyone else does who goes to a club or a bar. Just have a good time and be amongst friends.
Exactly.
That's what they did to merit this murder, this arson.
In 2018, Robert L. Camita announced in The Advocate, which is one of our local newspapers, that after extensive research, one of the three unknown victims could finally be identified as 32-year-old Larry Norman Frost. In the aftermath of the fire, many churches refused to hold funerals for the dead. Reverend William P. Richardson of St. George's Episcopal Church agreed to hold a small prayer service for the victims on June the 25th, which was attended by 80 people. The next day, Iveson B. Noland, the Episcopal Bishop of New Orleans, rebuked Richardson for hosting the service, and Noland received more than 100 complaints from parishioners concerning the service, and Richardson's mailbox was filled with hate mail.
That is truly disgusting. That those people, at the very least, even if they're being hateful and judgmental, cannot take some type of pity upon the dead.
Exactly. 2 additional memorial services were held on July the 1st at the Unitarian Church and at St. Mark's United Methodist Church, which was headed by Louisiana's Methodist Bishop Finis Crutchfield, and was led by the MCC founder, Reverend Troy Perry, who came from Los Angeles to participate. Mourners exited through the church's main door rather than an available side exit, which was one of the first demonstrations of a new willingness to be identified on camera as queer. In June 1998, the 25th anniversary of the fire, as a part of Gay Pride celebrations, a memorial service was organized by Reverend Dexter Brecht of Big Easy Metropolitan Community Church, also known as the Vieux Carré MCC, and Tony J.P. Pisani. The memorial was held at the Royal Sonesta Hotel Grand Ballroom and was attended by New Orleans Councilman Troy Carter, Reverend Carol Cotton Wynn, Senior Rabbi Edward Paul Cohn of Temple Sinai, Reverend K. Thomas from Grace Fellowship in Christ Jesus, Reverend Perry, and 32 members of the New Orleans community representing the victims. Troy Carter then led a jazz funeral procession to the building on the corner of Charter and Iberville Streets, and the members of the local MCC laid a memorial plaque and wreaths at the grave. Amongst the attendees was the niece of a victim who was named Clarence McCloskey. Since then, the attack has been memorialized in plays, magazine articles, books, and other forms of art. In 2008, local artist Skylar Feen constructed an art installation titled Remember the UpStairs Lounge, which was featured in the New Orleans Museum of Art. And up until the shooting at Orlando's Pulse nightclub in 2016, the UpStairs Lounge fire was the deadliest attack on the gay community.
And that's the kind of tragedy that you don't want to see surpassed by an even worse tragedy.
Well, Pulse, 49 people died in the Pulse nightclub attack.
Which was another pointless act of murder and cruelty that accomplished absolutely nothing.
Well, the reason why I mentioned Pulse nightclub is because look at the outpouring that happened in the aftermath of that tragedy. Very different from 1973.
Very, very sharp contrast. In Florida, like, for example, when there was a blood drive for survivors of that shooting, even Chick-fil-A was, the blood drive was on a Sunday, and they opened some of their locations to cook food for the blood donors and the phlebotomists who were taking the donations.
Huh.
So there are some religious people who, despite their feelings towards the gay community, still do have compassion
or they feel like in certain instances they want to do the right thing, but also I'm going to counter with that's corporate publicity.
There may be some truth to that, but it's really not that simple with Chick-fil-A, because they seem to be pretty strong in their religious convictions, as they know they're leaving money on the table by closing on Sunday, for example.
Right.
So I think in this case, they really thought they were doing the right thing, and obviously, Christians who are bigoted, who like Chick-fil-A, very likely did not approve of that act of compassion. It's just that some institutions are just simply more complex in their in their beliefs. There's obviously some people are rotten to the core and completely evil, and others have mixed emotions and just aren't willing to go as far as those who are pure evil in their convictions.
All right. Well, does that wrap up your final thoughts? I know you're tired.
Well, on that note, as far as these particular tragedies on Peacock Network, on the free version of it, you can stream the first episode of Queer as Folk, which has this entire season of Queer as Folk that's filmed on location in New Orleans, various parts of New Orleans, was inspired by the tragedy at the Pulse nightclub. But that's all I want to say on there without trying to give anything away.
Yeah, no spoilers.
Yeah. And keep in mind that the show Queer as Folk, for those who are not of the gay community, is a cultural exchange. You can watch Queer as Folk and potentially gain a better understanding of the gay community as a result. I think it's actually quite similar to some of the situation comedies that we had during the 1970s and the 1980s involving cultural exchanges with the African American community.
You mean like with All in the Family?
Exactly. Yeah.
And the Jeffersons and
right. It's.
I know that there's more, but I can't remember right now.
It invited television viewers to have a better understanding of a culture that was different from theirs.
Oh, I used to watch Webster in the 80s. Did you ever watch that?
Actually, I didn't. No.
Okay. Well, maybe it was a little. Well, anyway. But yeah, you're right. And I did want to say that Queer as Folk, I think it's actually is the one of the things that I've seen recently that has done a fantastic job of portraying the LGBTQ community as people, not caricatures, not the butt of jokes, people, because they're people too.
And you see that you only have to see the first episode to see the similarities,
right,
between shows that are primarily heterosexual based, the complexity of relationships,
yes,
in general, is virtually the same.
It truly is. And that's going to wrap up my final thoughts. How about you?
Well, I'd like to say to our LGBTQ listeners, happy Pride.
Yes, happy Pride. And thank you for listening to us. And please also know that if you, and this applies to anybody, if you want to join our Facebook group And if we ever say anything on this podcast that is not correct, make a post about it in the Facebook group and let me know. And we will correct any errors that we've made.
Yeah, we're all ears.
We're all ears. So next week, we are going to take our monthly break from Murder and Mayhem to discuss possibly the only openly lesbian politician in the history of the states. Her name was Barbara Scott, and we will be talking about her next week for a coffee talk.
Well, have a nice evening or good afternoon, whatever time you're listening to us.
Or like Coast to Coast AM, good morning or good evening, wherever you may be.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. All right. Well, until then, everybody, be safe, be kind. Remember that we're all human beings, and don't park next to vans.
Yeah. Endeavor to love one another is what I will say, as well as be proud of who you are.
And don't hold back.
Yeah. And do not resent yourself for any public perceptions of who you are.
And there's nothing wrong with you.
Absolutely not. You're an emotional human being like anyone else, and who has the same exact needs. Love yourself and love your community. And anywhere you go, if it's dark, if it's dangerous, you don't feel safe, don't be there in the first place. And if you ever speak to law enforcement and you're not the victim of a crime or the witness to a crime, lawyer up.